Welcome, everyone. Like many of you who are listeners to Israel Story and Wartime Diaries, I feel like I already know Mishy Harman. And every time I listen to one of his podcasts, I feel like I'm catching up with an old friend. So it is really a pleasure to welcome you, Mishy, to the Anshe Emet family.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Michael. Thank you. It's an honor
So,
to be here with you.
well, let me tell you just a little bit more about Mishy before we get started. Following his military service in Israel, Mishy studied history at Harvard, archaeology at Cambridge, and wrote his PhD, a biography of the first Protestant missionary in Ethiopia at the Hebrew University. And he lives in Jerusalem with his wife, Frederica, and their two dogs, Nomi and Golda. We know Mishy as the creator of Israel Story, which is the most listened to Jewish Israeli podcast in the world. And since October 7th, Wartime Diaries, which is billed as postcards from the war, has really garnered our attention. I would say that while Jews often refer to themselves as people of the book, we're actually people of the story. And Mishy, you're a master storyteller, and you're part of a family whose stories are really woven into the history of Israel. Your stories include accounts of your grandfather, Avram Harman, who served as Israel's ambassador to the United States, and your aunt, Naomi Chazan, former Israeli Knesset deputy speaker. You recall your father's story, Zichrono Livracha, about growing up in the 50s in Jerusalem, and those shared by your beloved grandmother, Zina, who lived across the street from you during her numerous daily visits to your house. So take a moment and share with us why you think stories are such a powerful medium.
Sure. Well, thank you. And thank you for summoning into the conversation all of my beloved family members. Some are with us and some no longer, who, as you were mentioning their names, really entered my mind and my heart. So thank you. Look, the truth is that you mentioned, Rabbi Michael, that perhaps even more than being a people of the book, Jews are people of a story, and I think that there's a deep truth to that because, in essence, we are a religion of which is a storytelling club, essentially, which gathers once a week to hear a story. And we've surrounded that story with all kinds of other things. Some will think they're more appealing than the story itself. Others will think that they're less appealing. But at its core, we're telling this story. And if you sort of think back to your early memories of your early Jewish memories, they all revolve around that story, really. At least that was the case for me. And it's a particularly interesting way of engaging with the story because we essentially engage with the same story over and over and over again. And perhaps what's changing is not the story, but us vis-a-vis the story as our lives unravel and we go from phase to phase in life. As for myself, as you mentioned, I spent many years in academic settings. And I noticed quite early on that when I heard arguments, I could be interested, I could follow them, I could agree, I could disagree, but pretty quickly I forgot about them. And I don't know if this is everyone's experience or everyone on this who's listening to this recording, but I don't remember, I don't know, 95% of the things that I learned in high school and in college and in grad school. But what I did notice was that stayed with me, were stories that had people who had to make decisions, who had feelings, who I could identify with or not identify with, who went through things that I could sort of imagine myself going through those kind of things. And to this day, most of what I do remember that I've been told ever in life are stories. And that's what I often find myself returning to and repeating in conversations and at dinner parties. And in an essence, and I'm sure we'll get to this in a second, but in an essence, I think that because of that, storytelling and particularly these kind of human interest stories are the most powerful prism through which to understand reality, um, uh, uh, to understand reality full stop, and especially reality in a complicated and polarizing place like Israel. I feel that in a very real way, these stories have a more lasting power than arguments.
It also feels, as a listener, that the stories also allow us to engage with the many nuances of Israeli life in ways that commentaries and politicians who often speak in very black and white terms don't allow us. And especially at a time when Israelis are often seen in darker ways outside of Israel. It's a really it's really sort of a kiddush Hashem that we have this opportunity. But you modeled Israel stories after Ira Glass's This American Life. And would you share with us how you were introduced to This American Life? Because I think it's just a great
Sure.
story.
Sure. Well, it's a particular pleasure to be talking about This American Life to a 150-year-old Chicago institution. Um, so um, uh, so essentially, I had never heard of podcasts in my life. Israel Story has been around for almost 13 years now. Will be perhaps, if God willing, we know calmer days to come, we'll celebrate a bar mitzvah this year. But as you mentioned, following my military service, so I'm from Jerusalem. I was born here. I grew up here. I lived here my whole life. And after the army, I came to the States for school, and then went to England for grad school, and came back to the States to teach, and was one of these people who didn't really know which path to take in life. Too many things seemed interesting to me, and I was at a point in my life where I was biographically, I sort of knew that at some point I was gonna have to choose a path, but everything seemed appealing. So I remember right around the time that I discovered podcasts, I had applied simultaneously to be a soccer coach in Northern Ireland, even though my soccer skills are only kind of mediocre plus, and to be I went to talk to folks in the Mossad, actually, to enlist in the Mossad, and I spoke to my father, who, as you mentioned, passed away this year, and was my real guide and compass in life, and a very, very wise man, and an educator, a professor of education. And my father said, if you don't know what you want to do in life, it's not a terrible idea to stay on the path that you're on. And that path that I was on seemed to be some academic path. That was my trajectory. And I decided to enroll in a PhD program. At that point, I had been out of Israel for 7 long years, and I thought to myself that it's about time to come back to Israel, and I thought that if I would stay in the States, then who knows if I'll ever come back. I'll meet someone, and I'll, end up being far away from my friends and family. And my mother was very excited about me coming home and settling down, meeting a nice Jewish girl. Of course, shortly after returning to Israel, I met a lovely Italian Catholic journalist here in Jerusalem, who is my wife and the mother of our daughter. But just before coming back to the Hebrew University to begin this PhD, which you mentioned, I thought to myself that 7 years is a long time to be away, and I need to mark that period or the end of that period in a more ceremonious manner than just boarding a flight at Logan and landing 12 hours later in Tel Aviv. So I bought a 2000 Ford Focus station wagon and packed all of my belongings into it, including my my dog Nomi, and we set off to search for America, as Simon and Garfunkel had sung about, and over the next 4-ish months, we traveled something like 20,000 kilometers through 43, 44 states, including a lovely time in Chicago and in Illinois, and in Springfield, which I had never visited before. And my best friend Ro'i, prior to me embarking on this odyssey, said, "Listen, you're going to spend a tremendous amount of time in the car. Why don't I download something called a podcast to your newly acquired iPhone 1?" This is in 2010. And I said, "Well, I don't know what a podcast is, but sure, if you want to." And then I promptly forgot about it and listened to books on tape and listened to music. And at some point I hit the Bible Belt and I started listening continuously to evangelical Christian talk radio stations, which were massively different, I shall say, than what I had previously encountered in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And after and it was really mind-blowing. It was things like Merv, the news coming out of the Capitol this week can point to one of 3 conclusions: Barack Obama is either the Antichrist, the devil, or a Muslim. And now let's go to our correspondent Yossi in Bet El. Tell us once again how the Palestinians have showed their true colors this week. And I thought that this was really far out and I couldn't get enough of it. And I was listening and listening and listening. And till after about maybe 3 or 4 days of this, I realized that there were essentially four topics that they cycled through. There was a mosque that was being proposed to be built on ground zero, and there was some gay marriage proposition in California, and there was the birth certificate. And then outside of Vicksburg, Mississippi, I remembered that Roy had downloaded these podcasts to my phone, and I listened to my first episode of This American Life. And it was so exhilarating because even though I was in the car and these voices were coming out of earbuds into my ears, I was magically being transported to, in the most intimate way, to the lives of Americans who I would otherwise never meet. Illegal El Salvadorian immigrants living in, cramped apartments in Plano, Texas, and farmers in Iowa, and billionaires making deals on Wall Street, and it was really exciting to me because it was so radically different than anything that I knew from the Israeli radio. And just in case anyone isn't as familiar as could be with Israeli radio, I brought you a little clip, which hopefully you'll be able to hear, which I culled at the time of what Israeli radio at the time sounded like, and to a large extent still sounds like today. So here it is.
מה ההבדל בינך לבין היטלר? כלב אדום שכמוך.
אז תלך קיבינימט לארצות הברית, אתה והחברים שלך, פשטינקן דרג גייב קיבינימטי, תעביר אותה מפה.
So even if you don't speak Hebrew, you can probably recognize that doesn't quite sound like your local public radio station. And the first thought that I had in my head after listening to my very first episode of This American Life is, Israel is the best place to do something like this. We're such a diverse society. People have come from so many different backgrounds and traditions and live such different lives in such a small place. Let's tell that story. And that's how we set off, really, me and three of my closest childhood friends, who I should, as a point of interest, say are my closest childhood friends from Noam, which is the youth group of the conservative movement in Israel, which was basically our home. That's what till the age of 18, we spent more time in Noam than we did at home. So these four Noamistim decided to embark together on this storytelling endeavor.
So you bring this back to Israel, but you also made a decision to keep it apolitical. Talk about that.
Right. So it was very clear to us that the easier option here would be to align ourselves ideologically and to tell stories within that realm. It's easier not only because the four of us actually shared an ideological bent, but also because when you want to create an audience for yourself, and when you want to try and break through, I mean, there were no podcasts in Israel at all when we began, but we were the first podcast here. But, you know, it would have been a much simpler task in many ways to say, okay, well, we're telling stories of the occupation. We're telling stories of, or, you know, going to the other side, we're telling stories of settlers, or we're telling stories of whatever it is. And then there's sort of echo chambers and sort of ecosystems where it's very easy to attract a following. But we said that very, very early on, in fact, I don't know if you can see, but that over there is the sort of result of the brainstorming session that we had in the very first time that we talked about the show. So we were brainstorming about names for the show and also about sort of guiding principles. And as you'll be able to see, the very first thing that, well, you can't see, but the very first thing that it says here is lo politi. And the reason for that was because we thought that was a much greater challenge to be able to tell a story. So I'll say it in a different way. Israel is a very compartmentalized society. Take Jerusalem, for example, where I live. Jerusalem has a million residents. 40% of them are Palestinians who live in East Jerusalem. A third of them are ultra-Orthodox Jews. And even though I grew up, and as you might be able to tell, I'm neither Palestinian nor an ultra-Orthodox Jew. And even though I grew up in a very open-minded and welcoming home, the truth of the matter is that I didn't have any Palestinian or ultra-Orthodox friends at all growing up. And my particular experience is not in any way unique. So I would say it's quite the norm. And what happens really in reality, because we also all live in close proximity, you know, Jerusalem's a small city, Israel's a small country, you see members of other groups all the time. You know, in the supermarket, in the shuk, on the light rail, and on the line in the hospital, whatever it is. And at least my experience, and since starting Israel Story 13 years ago, I've now learned that this is an experience of many, many people. What would happen almost always was that I would take in immediately what a person in front of me had or didn't have on their head, or what color skin they have, or what clothes they were wearing. And because we're very, very good at labeling people and understanding who they are very quickly, I would put them in a box or put a label on them and start piling up all the assumptions that I have of people who belong to that group. So I believed that I knew how how many kids they have and what newspapers they read and what political parties they vote for and what they did or didn't do in the army or what they think about the gay pride parade or what they think about the disengagement from Gaza, and on and on and on and on. And the result is that within a split second, you sort of create this quite detailed narrative about someone who you haven't exchanged a single word with. Right. And you think that you really know them. And we thought that by eliminating the visual aspect, as one does in a podcast, we would enable listeners this fairly rare grace period in which they could suspend their judgment, because it wouldn't be as easy for them to immediately label somebody they were listening to. And instead they could open their ears and open their minds, and as Edgar Keret says, practice their muscle of empathy and listen to stories of people who don't share their worldview or their lifestyle or their belief system. And for us, that was a social mission, and B, a much greater challenge. And we thought that if we could tell stories that allow you to sit and to listen and recognize the humanity in someone who you politically disagree with entirely, that would be a real thing, a real success, a measure of success.
And you go beyond the Jewish community. You've interviewed Muslims, Christians, you've interviewed rich people, poor people, gay, straight, Ethiopian, Russian. So in a way, you've introduced many people to individuals, human beings across that spectrum. How has that experience been for you?
Well, I was just going to say that even more than introducing listeners to other perspectives, I feel that I've introduced myself to other perspectives, because in reality, what I've been on for the last 13 years, not just me, but our entire team, which grew from my friends to now many producers who produce the show, and generations of producers and so on and so forth, is that I feel that I've been on a journey of discovering Israel. So my own understanding of Israel up until I started Israel Story was limited by the facts of my own biography, of the parents I happened to be born to, the neighborhood I happened to grow up in, the youth movement I was a part of, the institutions I attended, and so on and so forth. But in many ways, this microphone, this microphone, as I told you, I was a couple of minutes late just because I spent the entire day recording today in the kibbutzim, and that were hit most severely on October 7th. But in many ways, this microphone, I've often think of it as a kind of magic wand that gains me access into the houses and living rooms and kitchens and lives of people who otherwise I would have no opportunity to talk to, people who live very, very different lives. And I feel almost like a tourist in my own country, because where else or how, in what other kind of profession would I have the opportunity to bounce between such different worlds? I mean, I've come to understand that when we talk about Israel, I mean, we all have in our mind the Israel that we're talking about. And I'm sure each one of the people listening to this recording has their Israel in their mind. But for me, I've come to understand that Israel there isn't an Israel. The Israel of a farmer who lives in Moshav Balfouria in the Jezreel Valley is so radically different than the Israel of a yeshiva boy in Ponovich in Bnei Brak, which is so radically different than the Israel of a Bedouin teenage girl from Hura, which is so radically different from my Israel. And all of these are Israel at the end of the day. So I feel that I've gained perspectives on the country and in a way that I wouldn't have been able to otherwise. And in fact, something funny has happened to me over time, which is that now I'm almost surprised when people do conform to the stereotypes that I sort of would have normally assigned to them, because do we have time for like a 2.5-minute story?
Go ahead. Go ahead.
I'll give you an example that happened to me a couple of weeks ago, which once again just shows how massively complicated everything here is here. I've spent, like many other Israelis, almost every Saturday night for the last year and 2 months now, demonstrating against the government and the proposed judicial reforms. This I'm just saying myself. This has nothing to do with Israel's story, just as a private citizen. And for many, many years beforehand, demonstrating against Bibi in all kinds of different permutations.
Mhm.
A few weeks ago, a friend of a close friend of my brother's died, not as a result of the war. On the Thursday before the war began, meaning on October 5th, he didn't feel well. He went to the doctor, and 5 weeks later, he was dead, having succumbed to lung cancer. And he died, and he left 4 kids who are, I think, maybe between 7 and 13. And I went to the Shiva, and they are Persian Jews. The mother is an actual Persian Jew. She came from Iran, and speaks primarily Persian. And they're sort of semi Charedim, somewhere on the road between being Orthodox and Charedim, and live in a largely Charedi neighborhood in Jerusalem. I walked in. Needless to say, I sort of stood out a little bit in the Shiva. And I was sitting with the widow and with one of my brother's friend, the man who died, sister, who is sort of the black sheep of the family and who I know from many left-wing demonstrations outside of Bibi's house. And I was asking all kinds of questions, as one does in a Shiva. And then I said, "How are the kids doing?" And the widow said, they go to a Haredi school, a Mamlachti Haredi school, which is a stream I didn't even know existed. But a Mamlachti Haredi school in Ramot, and the school has been amazing, and the kids have created, a rotation of, there's always kids here, and the teachers are always here, and the principal, and yesterday a psychologist came on behalf of the school and sat with each one of my 4 kids on their own on the balcony, and so she was here for 2 hours and talked to them, and it was really meaningful. And then the left-wing sister, the woman who I know from these demonstrations outside of Bibi's house, says to me, "And guess who that school psychologist was?" And that school psychologist was Sarah Netanyahu. And this happened in the middle of the war.
Who's the prime minister's wife.
Right. And a much maligned character in certain sectors, and including in my house, or in my psyche. And the reason I brought that story is because I love it, because it taught me once again how complicated things are, that you never really understand the reality of one's life and who they are as a human being till you're able to hear their story.
It's an amazing story. It's really breathtaking. I want to just alert those who are on that one of the really wonderful aspects of Israel's story was that during the judicial reform, you took it upon yourself and your producers to air conversations with the descendants of signers of the Israel's Declaration of Independence. And there again, you get this amazing spectrum of different views And it was just a wonderful thing to listen to. And I want to just ask you to talk for a minute about that experience. And
Sure. So as you said, for the entirety of Israel Story's operating years, we tried to the best of our ability to stay out of what you would call political fields. Now, what constitutes politics and what doesn't constitute politics is perhaps a larger question. I mean, I would argue that airing a story about trans Orthodox rabbi is a political statement, or airing a story about the women of the wall is a political statement, or all kinds of things like that. But we, not to be sort of too cute here, we largely stayed out of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And while we, as you said, we always did have stories of Arabs and stories of Palestinians and so on and so forth, they really remained human interest stories and not stories so much of the occupation. Even when we did a series called The Wall and had an entire episode about the separation barrier or in the wall, the stories that we told were not stories that you might hear elsewhere about how the wall impacts the lives of Palestinians, but rather we tried to find sort of human interest angles around that too. And that worked very well for us for a long, long time, because we accrued a lot of, we accrued a lot of political capital and a reputation as being an honest broker. And as a result, we know a lot about our listeners. We're very data driven as an organization. And we have, secular and atheist listeners, and all the way to ultra-Orthodox listeners. And we have, listeners who are politically conservative and listeners who are politically progressive, and Jews and non-Jews also in quite significant numbers. Then 2023 was somewhat of a, 2023 was the most challenging year, obviously, that I think any of us can remember, in terms of telling Israel's story. And as I said before, I don't really believe that the entity Israel is a single thing. So, telling Israel's stories, I guess, is a more apt way of putting that. And it was challenging, of course, now since the outbreak of the war in different ways, and we'll talk about that in a second as well. But it's easy to forget, with all that's gone on since October 7th, that we were on the brink of a civil war here.
yes,
That people with very, very different visions of what this place should be were fighting out in the streets about the essence of the character of the notion of a Jewish and democratic state. And we felt that during that time, not referring to that would be more of a statement than tackling that head on. So we embarked on a project called Signed, Sealed, Delivered, with a question mark at the end, in which we sought out, and this was a lengthy process which took us almost a year, the closest living relative of each one of the 37 signatories of Israel's Declaration of Independence, and interviewed them not only about their ancestor, who, it's interesting, but we tend to think of the group who established the state as a pretty homogenous group. But when you come closer, it's sort of like a pointillist painting. You start seeing the pixels. You start seeing how they were different in many ways. So not only about their ancestors, but also about the vision with which their ancestors put their name to the Declaration of Independence, what they hoped to see here, what indeed happened over the last 75 years of independence. And the result was a real mosaic of Israeli society. I'll just say, for example, this will perhaps not surprise you, that though only 3 out of the 37 signers of the Declaration of Independence were ultra-Orthodox, something like 60% of the descendants living today are ultra-Orthodox Jews. And also many of them don't live in Israel, and some of them are no longer Jewish. And we also embarked on side projects of who didn't sign the Declaration of Independence, who was here and was not part of the party. Arabs, Druze, by and large Mizrahim, by and large women, and all kinds of other groups that were marginalized in those early years of statehood. And that series, which was interrupted midway by October 7th.
Yeah, it was. It's amazing. It's an amazing thing to listen to, and I really want to.
I very much hope that we can return to it.
I hope that people will take the time to listen, but I want to segue into Wartime Diaries, because these are very different. These are not quite as edited and produced as your normal show. And they're sort of snippets or postcards, as you call them, of people's lives. And each one has been traumatized in their own way by October 7th. And, listening to them, I continue to hear Yehuda Amichai's poem, Koter Petatza, The Diameter of a Bomb, which is a poem which talks first about the dimensions of a bomb, and then it talks about the resonance of that bomb and how it affects and upends people's lives. And it's a really remarkable thing to listen to. And of all of the things that I read, like most of us read constantly, those stories, I think, affect me most deeply, because I feel like I'm walking around Israel and I'm talking to someone. I'm getting to meet somebody who I largely may have never had the opportunity to meet. And maybe you could talk about that experience and what went into that.
Of course. So the war broke out on October 7th. Like everyone else here, we were in total shock and trying to figure out, among the zillion other things that everyone was trying to figure out in those early days, what our role would be during this new phase. It was very clear that this was a game changer, that you couldn't go on airing regular content about Israel, and in many ways our organization is ill-suited for this kind of a development. I mean, I would say humanity is ill-suited for this kind of a development, but also our organization is ill-suited for this kind of development, because our normal mode of operation is slow and deliberate, and we follow stories for many months and edit them endlessly and write original music. And here, things were changing so rapidly that really by the minute, and it was almost impossible to even understand, and I would say it's still impossible to understand what the story really is. There is no one story. And then we very quickly, in that very first week of the war, settled on this idea of we were going to start just releasing. We were going to interview people who were affected by the war. We didn't totally understand who those people were going to be early on. We thought maybe they would be the families of kidnapped hostages, or maybe they would. We didn't really know, and we were just going to have a conversation and edit it and release it that same day. And the project sort of took on a life of its own. And since then, we've released dozens of wartime diaries that have a very the profile of very wide spectrum of different experiences of the war, from, of course, families of hostages and families of people who were killed, and families of and people who themselves survived the carnage, to leaders of every possible civil society initiative, to moms who are at home with 4 little kids and a husband who's in Miluim, to really anything you could imagine, people getting married during the war, and farmers and chefs and artists and performers and archaeologists and educators and people on the left and people on the right and people, talk Holocaust survivors, and trying really to give listeners around the world a sense of how, as you just said, actually, everyone's life is impacted in a different way, of course, by these horrible events. And we wanted to give that sense, which sort of goes beyond the news. We're not reporting on the war. We're not reporting on what's happening. We're not CNN. We're not the New York Times. But we want to try to understand what it's like to just live in different shoes around the country.
Right. And so someone like Datya Itzhaki, who was living in Gaza pre-2005, and she tells this story, I think so towards the end, of really being deported out, being really physically torn out of the place that Ariel Sharon had promised to them forever and all the rest. But then she talks about the residents of Nir Oz who were celebrating their uprooting, if you will, and saying, that they were an obstacle to peace and all of that. And then her decision, or her desire, I should say, to go back and resettle. That was a very powerful. It's one thing to read about it in the newspaper, that some, quick comment, but to hear her and to hear her passion was really stunning to me. Or Shira Masami, who's this traditional woman who lived in Sderot, who's now like 250,000 other Israelis living somewhere else. But at the end of the podcast, she expresses, here's this very kind of lovely, traditional woman, talking about her kids, talking about their life and how I wish I had my own kitchen, and all the rest. But at the end, her rage, I should say, at Palestinians, especially those living in Gaza, was really palpable. And I wonder, you had sort of a proviso at the beginning, these views don't express ours. How was that a hard thing? I mean, what goes into what you put up there?
So thank you for asking that question. Just as we decided early on in Israel's story that we were going to profile the lives of all kinds of different Israelis without being committed to a specific political or social ideology, it was very important for us in this Wartime Diaries series to also to remain true to that, to recognize that many different people have very different views of what's going on at the moment. I have my own views, and it's, I think, advisable for everyone, or for anyone serious really, to at least consider views that aren't your own. And what we try to do, and it's not always easy, I should say, it's sort of a personal and professional challenge, is to allow people to make the best argument for their own case.
Right.
So, look, as I've sort of hinted at in a couple of times in this conversation, I do not share Datya Itzhaki or Shira Masami's views. Quite the contrary. But it was very important to me to make sure that both of those women and others who we've profiled in the series sound as if they're making the best possible case for why they think what they think. And And it's important for me that people be able to identify with them. So with Shira Masami, for example, as you said, we hear about her as a human being long before we hear about her political views. And I could well imagine that if we would have started off with her political views, a certain percentage of our listeners would have turned off the episode. And same is true with when we profile, left-wing activists, or a woman talking about her close friend who was a peace activist in Gaza who was killed during the war. And it won't surprise you that those are the episodes also that receive the most sort of polarizing feedback. But it's crucial, I think, that people hear people like Shira Masami or people like Sahar Vardi and understand where they're coming from. And I should say that we don't pick. We think very, very carefully about what stories we want to tell, what we haven't yet told our listeners, what is perhaps underrepresented, and we're not picking, nutcases or whatever. These are not, these are not sort of individuals who are totally fringe, and they represent groups within society who have valid opinions. And you can argue with them, of course, as we do, but this isn't about us arguing with them. This is about us allowing them to tell their truth and us bringing their truth to listeners, and trusting listeners around the world to be able to make up their own mind. And in fact, Shira Masami is a great example of that, because we had dozens of people write into us, how dare you not challenge, her views when she says, that as far as she's concerned, 2 million Gazans should be killed, and that everyone there is a terrorist, and so on and so forth. And on the other hand, we had people, listeners, who were so inspired by her that they reached out to us and asked us to put them in touch with her because they wanted to pay her rent. She's renting a place in Yerucham. And a mirror image also when we have sort of the more left-leaning episodes as well.
And if I could just add to that, as a listener, what I really appreciate, Mishy, is that that so much of the news that we hear is curated, right? It's from a particular viewpoint, and then there's going to be a commentary, some commentator who's going to tell you how to interpret that, right? Wherever you look, whatever newspaper you read, whatever publication, it's from a particular point of view. And what I loved about it was I could just listen, and nobody was kind of shaping it, and I could be offended, or I could be drawn in, or however, or listening to a Druze mayor talk about his experience, and just seeing the world through their eyes for a few minutes it's really a profound experience. Would you play just a short segment, because then I want to turn our attention to our 7th graders.
Sure. So I'll just play you a very short compilation. We released it for the 100th day of the war. So it's 100 seconds. So it's a minute and 40 seconds. But this is a little taste of, if you're not familiar with Wartime Diaries, of sort of the various different voices that we've heard, or some of the various different voices.
The last time we spoke was the 7th of October at 6:30.
I saw him putting his IDF uniforms, and I jumped out of bed as well.
And then we realized there are terrorists inside walking around the kibbutz, but there is no one to come and save you.
Tal Abba is on the way.
For now, I will act like she is alive and captured.
I said, if you want to kill me, would you allow me to die as it was?
And we sift through the ashes, and we try to find remains of the people there.
I didn't think such a thing can happen again.
I got married this Monday in the middle of war.
You're not a soldier anymore. You're 50 years old. What is the matter with you?
And there's no way on earth I could do this without exactly him. Not a strong partner, great partner. Him partner.
And he told me, take with you a sleeping bag and a tent and just go.
I texted him after I was told that he was killed.
From their eyes, I was a traitor.
Everybody needs their blankie.
their teddy bear, something to make them feel safe.
I'm just another grandfather looking after his grandchild while his son is off at war.
Well, what do you expect? You raised me to be this Zionist.
These children of Hamas now will be the killer of my children. I desperately wanted to talk about sex during my eulogy for Ido.
It's like a couple of kilometers from here. Like my friend has a 4x4. Let's just go cut across the fields and go get him.
During war, poets, they must write about love.
Everyone has to choose to be optimistic because we don't have room for pessimism.
And Rabbi Michael, I just would like to add one more sentence, which is that the first 20 odd Wartime Diaries that we released were all from a relatively mainstream Israeli Jewish perspective. I am very aware of the fact that that is a part of the story. The name of our show is Israel Story, and naturally we cannot adequately grasp the story of what's going on in Gaza to the same extent that we can here in Israel. And we don't have the tools to do that. And unfortunately, the situation is such that even if we did have the tools, it probably would not be a practical thing. But it was very important to us, to the extent possible, to challenge our listeners and to present them with narratives that were not the mainstream Jewish Israeli narrative. So as you said, we started layering in stories of Bedouins and Druze and foreign workers and Palestinians and people who have relatives in Gaza and stuff like that, because that too is part of the story. And of course, we're limited by what we can do, and we're aware of that limitation.
I'm going to turn our attention to Rabbi Forrester, who's with some of our seventh graders, and they have a question for you, Mishy.
Great. Hi.
Hi, Mishy. Rabbi Benji Forrester at Anshe Emet. I can't thank you enough for your time. As Israel Story celebrates its bar mitzvah this year, please God, with safety and peace and the return of all the hostages, we have a room here of our seventh grade class who is also...
Hala, let's do a joint bar mitzvah, bnei mitzvah.
We should. You'll host. And we spent the morning both consuming the amazing stories that you've produced. We listened to a few episodes and talked about the modality of podcasts, and also started to think about ourselves as storytellers of Israel's story and of our own stories. So as we had that conversation, Sydney Braun, who's one of our seventh graders with her bat mitzvah coming up, had the following question that she's going to ask you on behalf of her class.
Great. Hi, Tzipi. Nice to meet you.
Hi, nice to meet you. How do you think that American middle schoolers like us can contribute when we do not live in Israel and we're not adults?
Wow. I wasn't prepared for such a complicated question. Look, I think that one of the things that this war has brought to the fore is that there is no clear divide between the story of Israel and the story of Jews around the world. And I think that the horrible experiences that many people around the world have encountered since October 7th are very much part of this story of the war. And in fact, in Wartime Diaries, I don't know if you listened to those episodes, but we've talked to quite a few people in the States, rabbis and leaders, about anti-Semitism. We're working now on a couple of episodes about college campuses and so on and so forth. I think, the most powerful thing that you, and I don't know, I would probably argue with you about the not yet adults part of the question, because I think you have as much, or if not more, to contribute to these conversations than any adult. But I think that one of the things that you can do best, I mean, you all have friends who are all reading news and are all forming opinions about what's going on here. And opinions get formed quickly, and it's very difficult for people to change them afterwards, unfortunately. And often, especially in these kind of difficult times, people form clear opinions that seem to have a very obvious black and a very obvious white and a very obvious them and a very obvious us and a good and a bad. And I think one of the things that we try to do, and perhaps you guys can try to do in your conversations with your friends as well, is to try to confuse people and to try to mix things up and to present a picture which is more complicated and surprises people and lets people think. Like, that story that I shared beforehand about going to that Shiva and learning that Sarah Netanyahu had been there the previous day really confused me. Because like a lot of people, I too I form opinions and I'm sure that I'm right and so on and so forth. And then this kind of, it's not such a dramatic story at the end of the day, but this one little story forced me to rethink the way that I look at what I previously thought was a very clear and black and white issue. And I think that maybe you guys can do that as well. Whether it's through things that you learn on Wartime Diaries or things that you read in the news. And, one thing is certain, no matter what your teachers or your parents tell you, sorry to all the teachers and parents on the call, is that nothing here is simple. Everything here is complicated. Everything here is complicated. There is no black and white. Even now, there's no black and white. And I think that you are better positioned than most of us because you're in a stage of life when you are forming your own ideas to remind us of that very simple truth. So if I could ask you to do one thing, it would be to be ambassadors of complexity in your communities and among your friends, and to try to draw people into real conversations and to learn more, and come with questions rather than answers. I'll just end by saying that there was a famous physicist, I. Rabi, who won the Nobel Prize and was instrumental in the Manhattan Project. Anyway, when he used to say that when he came home from school, he grew up, I think, in the Bronx, in New York. His mother wouldn't ask him if he said something smart or answered a question in school, but she would ask or answered a question in school, but she would ask him, "What question did you ask today?" And I think that there's something very, very powerful in that as a way to open a conversation and to invite your friends and your peers in Jewish and non-Jewish circles to engage more fully with these very complicated topics. Sorry, that was a really long answer to a much better question than it was an answer, to be honest.
I think it's first of all, thanks to our 7th graders for a fabulous question. Mishy, we are so very grateful for what you and your friends have accomplished through Israel Story and now Wartime Diaries. And really, you've asked us to question our own thinking and meeting somebody. A person is a person; they're human beings, and we get to see that, and that's a gift. But I heard you your interview with our good friend Rabbi Cosgrove who was here at Anshe Emet before he was at Park Avenue, and you told a story about your grandmother, which I think is a good way to end. When you were talking about Gaza. And so I would love if we could just end our podcast, our conversation this way.
Sure. So my beloved grandmother, Zina, was born in 1914 in London. And when she was a young woman, she, like many other people, believed in internationalism and she didn't believe in the concept of nation states. And she met my grandfather because there was a debate one day in the early 30s, and the people debating were my grandfather, Abe, who was the head of the Zionist Student Union at Oxford University, and he was debating my grandmother, who was the head of the anti-Zionist Student Union at the London School of Economics. And the reason that she was an anti-Zionist, as I said, wasn't because she had any particular beef with the Zionist movement or with the idea of a Jewish homeland, but because she didn't really believe in the concept of nation states. Well, my grandfather clearly won the day ultimately, as my grandmother moved to Palestine in order to marry him in 1940, and he had come a few years beforehand, and then devoted the remainder of her very, very long life in service of the state in all kinds of various different positions in the parliament, and as an ambassador, and this and that. And in any event, my grandmother lived across the street from us, as you said, Rabbi, earlier. And she was a very important person in my life. And I would see her every single day. And she lived to be 99, and she passed away while I was holding her hand, and in her TV room. In the last few years of her life, her memory and her alertness wasn't what it was in her younger days. But occasionally she would sort of revive herself and pop up, and she was sort of my good old Savta once again. And one such day happened in 2006, which was 7 years before she died. She was 92 or 93. We were sitting in her TV room and watching TV together, and it was the middle of the Lebanon war. So I don't know if the seventh graders were alive. No, the seventh graders were not alive then. Perhaps everyone else on the call was and remembers. But in 2006, there was what was called the Second Lebanon War, and we were watching television, and out of nowhere, my grandma sort of straightened herself up in her chair and looked at me and said, "Look what a strange thing they're saying here on television. To the north of us, in the mountains of Lebanon, there's landscape, and there's mountains, and there's wildlife, and there's trees, and we humans have drawn a line in the middle of those mountains, and we call one side of that line Lebanon, and we call the other side of that line Israel. And now people from one side of the line have been shooting missiles and bombarding us on the other side. And as in retaliation, people from the other side of the line are advancing and sending troops in, and so on and so forth, and planes and tanks and infantry soldiers. And what is the television telling us, really? The television is saying that when Muhammad Salman from the Lebanese side of the line's life is upended, when his family is hurt or has to flee their home, or God forbid, when he's killed, no one is saying that we need to rejoice. Of course, that's never, the editorial line here in the Israeli media. But they're saying that we can essentially not care that much, because he's not one of our own. And on the other hand, they're telling us that when the exact same thing happens to Moti Cohen, who lives in Kiryat Shmona on our side of that line, we need to be deeply mournful, because he is one of our own. And my grandmother said to me, the truth of the matter is that I don't know Muhammad Salman and I don't know Moti Cohen, but I'm equally sad for both of them, because a person is a person is a person. And she looked at me, and it was the most, the simplest and most pure piece of advice and wisdom that she could have given me as a present. And it's one that in many, many ways continues to impact and guide my own thinking till this day.
It's a beautiful way to end our conversation, Mishy. And I look forward to a day when Israel Stories will be back on. And God willing, that more people will learn the wisdom of your grandmother as well.
Amen. Amen.
תודה רבה.
תודה. להתראות.
להתראות.